Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation on constructivism, uh, 21st century teaching, and my name is Ricky Holden. Tonight, we're going to be covering what is constructivism. Basically, it's a philosophical viewpoint about the nature of knowing. Specifically, it represents a knowledge standpoint. During its infancy, constructivism examine the interaction between human experience and the reflexes or behavior patterns. Constructivism does not refer to a specific pedagogy, although it is often confused with constructionism. Constructivism is often associated with pedagogic approaches that promote active learning or learning by doing. There are many critics of learning by doing, or aka discovery learning, as an instructional strategy. While there are much while there is much enthusiasm of constructivism as a design strategy, it would appear that constructivism remains more of a philosophical framework than a theory that either allows us precisely described instructions or prescribed design strategies. The second thing I'd like to look at tonight is who who are the foundational theorists behind constructivism. As you can see by the slide, there's quite a few that were considered the fathers of constructivism. First, I'd like to go over just a few though, but the remaining ones I'd like for you to review yourself and get a little background history on each one. Uh, the first one I would like to cover is Jean Piaget. He lived from 1896 to 1980. Uh, he was the formalization of constructivism from a within the human perspective is generally attributed to Jean Piaget, who articulated mechanicism by which information from the environment and ideas from the individual interacted and resulted in internalized structures developed by learners. He identified processes of accommodation and assimilated that are keys in the interaction as individuals construed new knowledge from their experiences. The next person I'd like to talk to you about is Levi Yavgotsky. Uh, he was from basically 1896 to 1934. He was a Soviet psychologist, the founder of the theory of the human culture and biosocial development, commonly referred to as cultural historical psychology. His main work was in developing psychology, and he proposed a theory of development of higher cognitive function in children that saw reason as emerging through practical activities in social environments. During the early periods of his career, he argued that the development of reasoning is meditated by signs and symbols. Therefore, cognitive uh, cognizance of culture, practices, and languages, as well as the universal cognitive process. The next person we'd like to look at is George Kelly. He basically lived from 1905 to 1967, and his fundamental views of personality that people are like naive scientists who see the world through a particular lens based on their unique organized systems of construction, which they use to anticipate events. Personal constructs their theories exploring the individual maps from they from by copying they form by copying the philosophical stresses of their lives. But because people are naive scientists, they sometimes employ systems of construing the world that are distorted by ideological and idiosyncrasies experimented by application to their current social situations. Next, let's take a look at John Brewer. Uh, he lived from 1915 to 2016. Uh, he was an American psychologist who made significant contributions to human cognitive psychology and cognitive learning theories in educational psychology. Brewer is one of the pioneers of cognitive psychology in the United States, which began through his own early research on sensation and perception as being active rather than passive processes. Next, let's take a look at our third question. How does constructivism differ from traditional ideas about teaching and learning? First, let's look at the curriculum. While traditional teaching approaches, basically the lecture method, is very common in education, especially at university levels, uh, it differs by basically constructivism is a theory of instruction based on observation to judge how people learn. Constructivism is a paradigm that hypothesizes learning as an activity, contextual and constructive process. Constructivism is a reaction to teaching approaches such as behavioralism and programmed instruction. Let's take a look at how the student is viewed. In traditional methods themselves ignore the student's consequential, the mental level of the interest and of the student. It involves coverage of the context and notes memorization as part of the student's. Uh, it's the student gets what he's given, and that's it. Uh, the learner acts as in constructivism. The learner acts as an information constructor. Learners construct knowledge based on their personal experiences and hypotheses of the environment. So how does this work? How do the students work? In traditional methods, we all know it basically does not involve the student in creative thinking and participates in the creative part of activities. Basically, they're given an assignment to complete, they complete the assignment, and they turn it in. The learner in constructivism actively constructs and creates their own subjectivity and objectivity realities. Learners, through social negotiation, continuously test their hypotheses and create a new knowledge. Uh, correct previous, they correct their previous knowledge or mistakes and confirm present knowledge. Learners link new knowledge to their prior knowledge. Constructivism argues that the learner is not a blank slate, but brings past experiences and cultures factors to a construct of new knowledge in the given situations. So basically, it builds off the student's present knowledge and allows them to make the mistakes and make their own decisions as they go through. How does the teacher's role play into this? In the traditional classroom, teachers often look like a one-person show, which basically is largely uninvolves the learner. Traditional classes are usually dominated by direct or unilateral instruction. Basically, the teacher stands in front of the classroom, gives direction or lecture, and hopes that the student gets that knowledge. In a constructive classroom, students play an active role in carrying out experiments and reaching their own conclusions. Teachers assist the students in developing new insights and correcting them with previous knowledge, but leaves the discovery and discussion to the student group. Questions are posed to the class, and the students and student teams work together to discuss and reach agreements on their answers, which is then shared with the entire class. Let's take a look at assessment. Assessment basically in traditional classrooms, research has found that the teacher centered lessons or the traditionals can be less or non-productive in some cases, detrimental to students' learning process. Basically, as the old saying goes, after about 20 minutes of lecture, everything shuts down anyway. So they're really not learning anything new after that point in time. They're just either taking notes or going through the standard process. But in constructivism, constructive groups indicates a high level of satisfaction and indicates students' participation. Increased student participation was evident. Students were more willing to volunteer answers and ask questions of the instructor in order to clarify material. And teams discussed results in many new points being introduced in the classroom. Students provide that constructivism teaches methods in teaching is far better compared to traditional methods. Basically, what this is saying is you kind of putting it in the student's hands. The teacher steps back and acts as a guide, is there to answer questions as they arise, but allows the students to research and look for that knowledge and step out on their own and basically form their own opinions and open up discussion to where they can actually get input from each other and from their research. Let's go ahead and take a look at the question 4 for our subject tonight, and it is what is the PAR model of learning and how does it relate to constructivism? Excuse me. PAR stands for Present, Apply, Review. Teaching today, it is based on research collected from many experiments on what type of teaching promotes the most effective learning for students. The PAR model places much emphasis on the student taking more responsibility for their own learning, with the teacher acting more as more as an instructor and facilitator. Basically, what I was talking about before, the student is taking responsibility for their role in learning. They're doing the research. They're working in the groups. They're allowing for new thought process. Basically, the PAR model is based on a theory of constructivism itself. Based on the work from Paget, constructivism predicts that it would help students to get them to recall the relevant events prior to learning and experiences into which they will build new learning and then give them a structure for the new learning. Once the structure and its foundations are in place, you can then present the details, or the P, in PAR. After presenting the new material, have the learner apply the new material, or the A, in PAR. And then after presenting the new material, finally you should review, basically asking questions requiring them to recall the prior learning necessary to understanding the answer. One approach is to use the teach by asking method, basically where you go back over what was taught or presented earlier, cover how they applied it, and then ask the questions about what they did. You ask a question that requires recall of what you intended to build on. Students create an answer in a small group and report back to the class in assertive questioning style. You correct misconceptions and top up with anything they missed or the R of the process. The next thing we were asked that I'd like to cover with you is basically I'd like to provide a scenario of topics of one of the topics that I actually teach that you could use to teach using constructive approach. Basically, I do this in the PAR format. As I am not I do not normally teach a curriculum as in a K to 12 setting. I'm an adult instructor for the military. I teach normally 18 to 45-year-olds, but I do use the constructive approach in my instructions, And I will outline one of my courses briefly, and we'll cover some of the timetables that I use for these events. Basically, what I do is 1 month prior to us going out to do a training event or instruct as the lead instructor, uh, I request the names and the MOSs of the teams that are going to be in the class, and I do a complete review on them. 2 weeks prior to the training event, I send all the instructional material uh, to the units and make sure that it gets down to the trainees. The reason I do this is basically this is a a new equipment that most of these guys have never seen before, but they may have some similar aspects of what this is from their specific MOSs that they've been in. So that's where I try to do the P part is in the scenario for the presentations. I let them review the material. I let them start forming their own conceptions of what it is, and then I'll try to evaluate that as I get into the actual presentation the first day of the event. We do a brief review of the instructional material, which they all should have covered by now, and then we start the training presentation. Uh, the courses that I teach range anywhere from a 1 week event to a 6 week event. So it can take some considerable time to do. Then I get into the applied methods. 3 weeks of the 1 month, basically of the training, we're going through scenarios to where they're using their team building skills. They use their model concepts that we've given them in the presentations, and they basically develop scenarios, and they're run and the emplacements are accomplished. And basically, from that, what I try to do is allow them the A piece or the application piece of this, and I try not to rush them. I take into account what they're learning and what they've come back with and what kind of information they're trying to gather from these in place systems. And basically, these in place systems are detection type systems, or they're robotics, or whatever the class may be presented at that time, and basically it's intelligence gathering equipment. So to keep their thought processes open, and we always do this in groups, at least a 5-man group, to where I can take their information that they're giving back, and I use that as part of my review process for myself whenever I'm doing my instructional reviews on my stuff, so I can actually build those scenarios into what I'm trying to teach them. But even after we get through with our the application piece of our emplacement, we do what's called an after event, or an AAR, after action review, for every one of our classes that we do. This can range anywhere from 3 to 5 days. We go over everything that was accomplished in the proper scenario evaluations. We do a complete AAR, which allows us to actually take this process one step further to where their command sections and everything will be able to look at what they did during this training scenario, and they can actually get an evaluation themselves from what we taught the students. So it goes through that complete process. And the last thing, but not the least thing that I actually do in my training, I do a trainee questionnaire. Basically, before we ever started, whenever they sent me those MOSs and the names of the people, that gives me a generalized background of what these folks are starting at. So I have a starting point there, and now at the end of the training, I can do this trainee questionnaire evaluation, and that's going to let me know where I have reached in my scale. Uh, we actually take it one step further than that actual review process. 6 months after the initial training event, I actually go out and I deploy with the unit to the field for what we call a field exercise. They've had their equipment now for roughly 6 months. We go to different areas of the world for their what they call advanced training or field readiness training, and we will actually sit back and allow them to develop an entire scenario around the inputs that they're being given at the time, and we'll take that and take it and watch them actually employ and deploy the equipment. We evaluate the trainees on their placement techniques. Then after that is done, we do another review of any of the issues that the trainees may have. And then that is getting them prepped and ready to actually deploy into a combat situation. After their deployment, which is usually 12 to 18 months, we actually go back to that unit. We provide a follow up questionnaire, and then we review any lessons learned while they were in the field. I hope this has been an informative lesson. Some of the references of where I got my uh, information from is in some of the slides here that I'm going through, is some of the mission sets that we've actually trained. And then the references here are where I actually got my information from, as far as the first four questions of our lesson tonight. I hope this has been informative. My name is Ricky Holden, and this is my presentation on constructivism. I hope everyone has a good night, and I hope it was informative. Thank you.